At sunrise on August 24, 1814, Washington was still the capital of the United States. By sunset, the American army had collapsed. The president was on the run. Government clerks were throwing records into wagons, and British soldiers were walking toward the president's house, where a dinner table had been prepared for guests who would never arrive. The invaders ate the meal. Then they set the building on fire. This was not the fall of some distant frontier fort. This was Washington, barely 14 years after the federal government had moved there. And the strangest part was not that the British reached the capital. It was how little stood in their way. To understand how America lost Washington in a single day, we have to begin with a dangerous assumption. Almost everyone believed the British would attack somewhere else. The War of 1812 had already lasted more than 2 years. The United States had gone to war over British restrictions on American trade, the seizure of sailors, and a larger struggle over power in North America. American forces had invaded Canada. They had burned public buildings at York, modern Toronto, and destroyed property elsewhere in Upper Canada. Britain wanted revenge, but it also wanted a target that would humiliate the young republic. In the spring of 1814, Napoleon was defeated in Europe. Britain could now send battle-hardened troops across the Atlantic. Thousands of men who had fought the French were redirected toward North America. In the Chesapeake, British ships had already spent months raiding towns, destroying supplies, and testing American defenses. Washington knew an attack was coming. It simply did not know where. Baltimore looked like the obvious target. It was a major port, a center of privateering, and a far more valuable military objective than Washington. The capital itself was small, unfinished, and spread across broad avenues surrounded by fields, marshes, and scattered construction sites. That apparent lack of military value became its greatest weakness. Secretary of War John Armstrong believed the British would not waste their time on Washington. Defensive preparations were late. Command was confused. Militia units were called out, moved, delayed, and placed under officers who had barely trained together. The man given responsibility for the capital's defense was Brigadier General William Winder. His task was almost impossible. He had to protect Washington, Baltimore, Annapolis, and the surrounding region with a mixture of regular troops, sailors, Marines, and militia. He did not know where the British would land. He did not know which road they would take. And he could not count on his men arriving when he needed them. On August 19th, British troops began landing at Benedict, Maryland on the Patuxent River. Major General Robert Ross commanded the army. Rear Admiral George Cockburn, aggressive and experienced in Chesapeake raids, accompanied the advance. Their force was not enormous, roughly 4,000 men, but many were disciplined veterans. They marched in brutal August heat, carrying weapons and equipment through dust and humidity. The Americans watched, guessed, and waited. Was the British column moving toward Washington? Or was it a feint designed to pull defenders away from Baltimore? Even after the direction became clearer, the response remained chaotic. Orders crossed, units shifted position. Cabinet officials interfered. Secretary of State James Monroe rode through the countryside gathering information and advising on troop placement. President James Madison himself went out toward the expected battlefield. Think about that. The Commander-in-Chief of the United States was approaching an active battle, not from a protected headquarters, but on horseback, surrounded by senior officials who were still trying to determine where the army should stand. By the morning of August 24th, the British were moving toward Bladensburg, a small town northeast of Washington. To reach the capital, they had to cross the eastern branch of the Potomac, today's Anacostia River, and push through the American defenders positioned beyond it. On paper, the Americans had advantages. They were defending a river crossing. They had artillery. They had more men available in the area. The British had marched for days in punishing heat and were operating far from their ships. But a strong position is useless when the army occupying it is divided into separate lines that cannot properly support one another. The first American line stood near the bridge. Other units were placed farther back. More troops waited on higher ground, disconnected from the men in front. Some commanders could not clearly see the battlefield. Many militia soldiers had never experienced enemy fire. Then the British arrived. Their light troops moved through Bladensburg and approached the bridge. American guns opened fire. For a moment, the crossing became a killing zone, but the British pressed forward. They used Congreve rockets, wild, screaming weapons that were often inaccurate but psychologically terrifying. The rockets left trails of smoke, burst unpredictably, and produced a sound few American militiamen had ever heard. The first American line began to give way. Retreat might still have been controlled. The second line might still have held. But confusion spread faster than orders. Men saw units in front of them moving backward and assumed the battle was lost. Gaps opened. Officers shouted contradictory commands. Militia formations broke apart. Soon, the retreat became what Americans bitterly called the Bladensburg races. Soldiers threw away equipment to move faster. Roads filled with men heading toward Washington and Georgetown. The army that was supposed to shield the capital was dissolving in the summer heat. But not everyone ran. Farther back, Commodore Joshua Barney had positioned a force of sailors, flotillaymen, marines, and artillery. Barney had spent the summer harassing the British with a small Chesapeake flotilla before destroying his own gunboats to prevent their capture. Now his men became the final serious obstacle between the British and Washington. Their cannon tore into the advancing troops. Marines and sailors held their ground while militia units disappeared around them. For a time, Barney's position stopped the British advance and inflicted real casualties. But his force was too small and increasingly isolated. British troops moved around the flanks. Barney was wounded, with no larger defensive line left to support him. His men were overwhelmed or forced to withdraw. The road to Washington was open. President Madison had seen enough. He and his cabinet left the battlefield and began a confused escape through roads crowded with retreating troops and frightened civilians. Back in Washington, people could hear the battle. For hours, distant cannon fire rolled across the city. Residents climbed to rooftops and hills, trying to see what was happening. Rumors moved faster than facts. One moment, the Americans were holding. The next, the British had been defeated. Then exhausted soldiers began appearing in the streets. That was when uncertainty turned into panic. Government workers rushed to save what they could. At the Capitol, clerks loaded records into wagons and carried them away. Other documents were abandoned because there was not enough transportation. The federal government was not conducting an orderly evacuation. It was running out of time. At the president's house, Dolly Madison waited for her husband. A dinner had been arranged for dozens of guests. She watched the road, received messages, and prepared to leave, but delayed long enough to direct the rescue of important papers, silver, and the large portrait of George Washington painted by Gilbert Stuart. The popular legend says Dolly personally cut the portrait from its frame and carried it away. That is not what happened. The portrait was too large and mounted too high. Dolly ordered it saved. White House staff and others broke the frame, removed the painting, and carried it to safety. Among the most important witnesses was Paul Jennings, an enslaved teenager in the Madison household, who later corrected the heroic version of the story. The truth is more interesting than the legend. Dolly Madison did not need to carry the portrait herself. Her crucial decision was refusing to leave the symbol of the nation's first president for the British to capture or destroy. Finally, she fled. The British did not enter Washington immediately. After the fighting, Ross rested his exhausted troops. As evening approached, the column resumed its march. Around 8 o'clock, British soldiers reached the capital. There was no American army waiting for them. Near Capitol Hill, shots were fired from one or more buildings. Ross's horse was killed, and the British responded by burning a nearby house. Then they moved toward the great unfinished Capitol. At the time, the building consisted of two main wings connected by a temporary wooden passage. Inside were the chambers of the House and Senate, government offices, works of art, and the small congressional library. The British piled furniture into the House chamber. They used torches, rockets, and combustible material. The library's thousands of books became fuel. Flames spread through the Capitol. The building that represented the American Republic became a furnace, visible across the city. Then Ross and Cockburn rode down Pennsylvania Avenue. Behind them, the sky glowed red. Ahead stood the president's house. The mansion was deserted. The Madisons were gone. Staff had fled. But the dining table was still set, and food and wine were waiting. The exhausted invaders helped themselves. Imagine the scene. British officers inside the home of the American president, eating the meal intended for his guests while the Capitol burned behind them. When they finished, the destruction began. Furniture and curtains were piled together. Fires were lit inside the rooms. Flames climbed the walls and burst through the windows. The heat became so intense that the roof and much of the interior were destroyed, leaving the scorched outer shell standing against the night. The Treasury, War Department, and other public buildings were also targeted. Most private homes were deliberately left alone because British orders focused on government property. This was not an attempt to occupy Washington permanently. It was a punishment, a message. The United States had invaded British territory and burned public buildings. Now Britain had entered the American capital and burned the symbols of the government itself. And the destruction was not carried out only by the British. At the Washington Navy Yard, Commodore Thomas Tingey could see smoke rising over the city. The yard contained ships, weapons, supplies, workshops, and equipment that could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. So Tingey gave the order. American sailors set fire to their own naval facility. Ships and stores burned along the river. Explosions echoed through the darkness. Washington was now being destroyed from both directions. British troops burned the government's political symbols, while Americans burned their own military assets to deny them to the enemy. James and Dolly Madison spent the night separated, moving through the countryside and trying to find one another. The President of the United States had no capital, no secure headquarters, and no certainty about where his government would meet next. For the young republic, this was humiliation on a scale that is difficult to imagine today. And then, on August 25, the weather changed. A violent storm swept through Washington. Torrential rain fell on the burning city. Contemporary accounts also described a tornado that tore across parts of the capital, lifting debris, damaging buildings, and reportedly killing both British soldiers and civilians. The rain helped extinguish the fires. Later retellings transformed the storm into a patriotic miracle, as though nature itself had risen to drive the British out. Reality was less dramatic. The British had never planned to hold Washington for long. Their force was deep inland, exposed, and separated from its fleet. The storm added confusion and damage, but it was not an American victory. After completing the destruction of their targets, the British withdrew. Washington had survived, but it had not been saved by its defenses. The damage was enormous. The Capitol was gutted. The president's house was a burned shell. The Congressional Library was gone. Government departments had lost offices and records. For a moment, some questioned whether the Capitol should even be rebuilt in the same place. But the British attack produced an unexpected result. Instead of ending the city, it fixed Washington more firmly in the national imagination. Congress returned. The government operated from temporary quarters. The Capitol and President's House were reconstructed. Thomas Jefferson sold his personal library to Congress, creating the foundation of a larger new Library of Congress. And only weeks after the humiliation at Washington, American defenders stopped the British at Baltimore. During the bombardment of Fort McHenry, Francis Scott Key watched an enormous American flag remain above the fort and wrote the words that became the Star-Spangled Banner. The contrast was powerful. At Washington, the government fled and its buildings burned. At Baltimore, the flag was still there. That is why the fall of Washington matters. It was not simply a story about British soldiers burning the White House. It was a chain reaction produced by false assumptions, divided authority, late preparation, and an army that looked stronger on paper than it was in reality. The Capitol did not fall because one wall was breached. It fell because there was no coherent defense behind the wall. On the morning of August 24th, the United States controlled Washington. By nightfall, the Capitol was burning, the president's house was burning, the Navy Yard was burning, and the president was somewhere in the darkness beyond the city. America did not lose its capital after a long siege. It lost it in a single day.